Okay. Well, hello, welcome. Um, welcome especially to you, Barbara. Barbara Sarah Smith, my co-author and friend, and I'm really delighted that you're going to be speaking today about your journey with Lyme. I think the title of this call, this webinar, is From Suggestibility to Clarity: My Journey with Lyme Disease. And I mean, this is very much uh, uh, your field of expertise, and but just as someone who doesn't know very much about Lyme, it would be really helpful, I think, if you were to say a little bit about what Lyme disease is, and your experience of it before you had the journey from the journey towards clarity, and what exactly what that means from suggestibility to clarity. So I think the easiest thing, Barbara, is if I just hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm so glad to have an opportunity to talk about this because it's an area that I've developed a lot of clarity about after a very, very difficult journey. So to start out, I'll tell you a little bit about Lyme disease for people who aren't familiar with it. There's probably a lot more unknown about this than what we know. But what we do know is that ticks particularly, but other stinging and biting insects have contained in them, like we've known about malaria or, cat scratch fever or lots of other things, that are transmitted from insects, mostly from insects. I mean, it is all from insects in the case of Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is really a bacterial infection that is transmitted primarily by ticks, and it's a spirochete, similar to a spirochete that causes syphilis. And it is a very serious issue. Now, Lyme disease itself is sort of an unknown. I mean, we really, there's a whole lot of organisms that are contained in ticks. And so depending upon what's in the tick that bit you, you may have a whole number of what we call co-infections. So people refer to this as a Lyme complex of illness, or Lyme just can be a real misnomer. So we really want to keep it so that we're not just talking about one thing. But I hope that helps. Is that helpful to you, Christian? Does that help you? So it's a bacterial infection, may have other viruses and things contained in ticks that are considered Lyme disease. So
Yeah, and it's, as I understand it, it's not all. There are certain regions where Lyme is more prevalent. So there are regions where ticks exist, but Lyme doesn't. Is that right?
well, that's true, depending upon the kind of ticks. And one of the things that I learned is that the highest, just for you in the UK, one of the highest incidences of Lyme is actually in London. Even though there are a heck of a lot more ticks up in the Highlands where you are, and up, in the bogs of the North Country, there are more people in London. So they, wherever there are animals or birds flying above, anything that migrates can bring it. So it is now on every continent. And yeah, there are certain areas where it's more prevalent, but now if you look at the maps of where it is all over the world. There really is no place in the world where it doesn't exist.
Right.
So this is an area that touches the lives of many, many millions of people around the globe. And as we have now learned with COVID, we know a lot less about it than we actually have facts. For anyone who has long-term COVID, there are a lot of, these are very serious infections that are evolving with climate change. And in a way, it's Darwinian medicine that as we develop better things to kill them, they develop better ways of surviving. So I just want to start out by saying that people who struggle with this, who have these infections, can be extremely ill. Other infections or other illnesses may impact one organ in your body or one part of your body. These can impact many parts of your body, and you can be very, very ill, as I was at the beginning. So that's just in the way of background.
And when was the beginning for you?
Well, the
For you?
beginning, as it turns out, I'd been bitten by ticks many times over the course of my life. The first time was when I was 19. That I know of anyway. I had two ticks embedded in me and when I was 19, and when I got older, I had in my early 20s, I developed heart issues. You know, I never really thought about it. I also had to go to bed in college at like 9 o'clock, but I didn't really think much about that. And who knows whether that was Lyme or not. But then in 2008, I was bitten again by a tick that was embedded for quite a long time. And after that bite, which now I know, or found out ultimately that it had many organisms in it. So I had a multi-organism infection that went right into my neurological system. And I had some very, very difficult symptoms. I had terrible sound sensitivity, light sensitivity. I had a terrible tremor. I would not be able to focus or concentrate. I had a lot of numbness throughout my body. There was a lot of confusion. I remember one day driving to work and I got to the end of my driveway and I couldn't remember where I was. So it was clearly impacting my mind and my body in ways that were very powerful and very, very difficult. So, but what I saw during that time, and this is sort of what we're here to talk about today, because we don't want to focus so much on the problem, but I also don't want to underwrite or minimize in any way the seriousness of these infections. Again, we've seen this from COVID. These are nothing to sneeze at when they really get a hold of your system. What I see now about my journey was that while I was really sick, and I clearly was, I think the way that my mind was working often played against me, worked against me, and perhaps really made things a lot worse than they needed to be, made things last a lot longer than they even were, and actually cost me a great deal of money. A great deal of money. I ended up spending $100,000 out of pocket on my treatments. And I know people in the Lyme world who have spent millions, literally millions of dollars trying in the search for wellness. So that's really what I want to talk about, is this sort of two-tier process that is happening for all of us in every moment. For those of you who are familiar with the principles that we're talking about here, you know, our experience is always, our experience of whatever happens to us, whether it's cancer or illness or, you know, old trauma or anything in the world that happens, is being put through the filter of our thinking. It's not a direct experience of the event itself, but our thinking is what then creates the suffering around it. So at the time that I had these organisms living in my body, and I was very ill, I did not know this. I did not know what I now know about the source of our experience and the way our minds are designed. I did not know about the principles. But ultimately, in my journey of 8 years, I did learn about it. You know, it actually led me to that, which I am eternally grateful for. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So just to say, to start off, obviously when all of these things were happening to me and I was really, it was unknown to me completely what was going on, I was terrified. I was living alone. I was self-employed. I had some pretty bad, financial insecurity. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And I had grown up in a medical family. My father was an old country doctor. He'd been dead for many years, but he had a great deal of wisdom and common sense. And I grew up believing that the medical system had everything I needed, that you went to the doctor, you got a pill, they made you better, you went home, you felt better, and everything was going to be fine. And it was a really rude awakening for me that I would now call an insight. My first insight along my journey was that I realized that the medical community, the Western medicine, had very little, if anything, to offer me. And that, again, in my mind at that time, made it even more terrifying. I remember saying to one doctor that I saw, I feel like I've gone down the rabbit hole. And he just looked at me and he said, you have. So that's not terribly comforting. when the doctors will tell you you've gone down a rabbit hole and we don't have any answers for you. But I think what was worse about that for me was that it would have been one thing. And actually one of my colleagues and friends who is a medical doctor and ultimately became my primary care physician did say to me early on, something happens with Lyme disease that doctors don't really understand, and doctors don't like to admit that they don't know. And that was one of the great gifts that anyone ever gave me during the early part of my journey. But that also came with the insight that, these guys are shooting in the dark, and they have no clue. And not only do they not have a clue, but one of the things and one of the damaging things that I think happens and happened certainly to me and to many other people who struggle with this and with other kinds of illness is that not only do they not know, but they don't admit that they don't know. And so then they turn it around on the patient. And then the patient becomes, there's some either implication or just outright statement that this is not only all in your head, but that you need psychiatric help because you're making it up, because we don't know how to fix it. And that's really damaging. So, I in this fear, what I would do, and then this insecurity that, oh my God, nobody knows what to do. Like, now what? Now, this is really scary. And I then just started searching. I would spend hours on the computer trying to find answers, trying to find the next best thing. Everybody was saying you have to have long-term antibiotics, 2 years, 3 years. You need multiple antibiotics. You need IV. You have to have an IV. So I chased an IV. I pushed and I pushed these doctors, and finally get my IV, and I'm like, oh, whew, now good, this is going to go away immediately, and of course it didn't. Not only did it not go away, but that was really the beginning of my next, again, all of this is now in hindsight, my next insight, because hindsight is insight, was to see, my body told me when it was done with antibiotics. It was like, I remember it was a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in my room. The IV was happening in my at home. And it was just done. It was like, I got to get this thing out of me. And I called my doctor on Sunday afternoon. I said, you got to get this out of me. And he said, okay, I'll have somebody there first thing in the morning to get it out. And they did. They came and they took it out. And that was like, wow, that's interesting. My body just told me what to do. Now, again, I didn't really make much of it at that point, but I really, my body gave me very clear symptoms, very clear warning. And one of the things in now what I see with this is that a symptom really is about, pointing you toward to look here. Look here. Like that's what they're telling you. Now, when you don't know what you're looking at, or you don't know what's going on in that system, and you have no trust in that system, I think that's the fearful part for me, is I had no trust, because there's so much information out there that you can no longer trust your immune system, because these organisms are much more powerful than your immune system. They've learned how to avoid the immune system. So you read all this information, and again, for me, it just fed the terror, the terror, like there's no way out of this. And then of course, the school of thought was, you have a chronic inflammatory illness. These things have been multiplying in your body. They're in every organ in your body. Basically you're screwed, and you have this for life, and you're going to have to manage it for life. You have to have a really strict diet. You have to, so for anyone who has ever tried to treat themselves off the internet, especially when it comes to the subject of Lyme disease, your head is spinning like 360 degrees on any given day, because whatever piece of solid information you find, you can find somebody who tells you the exact opposite, right? So you'd be like a ping pong ball. Oh, I have to do this. I have to drink this much water. I have to drink this much, I don't know what it was I was drinking, but you have to take herbs. You shouldn't take herbs. You never take, take this kind of vitamin, never take, get sunlight, don't get sunlight. So on top of being already fearful, there was no grounding in, why don't you just quiet down and listen to your own intuition and see what makes sense to you? Even though that was happening, I really was listening to my intuition, but I didn't know that that's what I was doing. And so that was what took me on this, this roller coaster ride of I got to do this, I got to try that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to try that. Now, that being said, in spending all this money, again, what I now see about that was that there was this part of me that, while it was being driven by fear, which is never a good thing to be driving your bus, just let me say. But while it was being driven by fear, it was also curiosity. Like, this is interesting. Let me try this. Like, this is kind of interesting. This is kind of cool. This is really outside the box. Because again, it was very clear to me that the medical community didn't have what I needed. So there was this part of me that was open and curious, and willing to try, willing to sort of make myself into a guinea pig, having nearly killed myself on 4 different occasions doing that. I would not advise that to anyone. But I think the curiosity that is part of my nature, of all of our natures, if we can tap into it rather than a fear-based exploration of anything, a curious, I really started to learn a tremendous amount. I mean, and again, I could have saved myself a lot of money and a lot of time if I had known this, because I wouldn't have jumped so quickly. I know lots and lots of people, many of my friends where I live in Massachusetts, have Lyme. They've been sick, many of them, most of their lives, and off and on. And, not everyone was going after it in the same way I was. They were much calmer, they much more clear-headed. I have one friend, Charlie, who came to see me because I became the great Lyme expert. And so everybody would come to see me. And, you know, I would lay all this information on Charlie about the smorgasbord of treatments you can choose and everything. And he'd just sort of look at me and go, well, you know, I think I can fall down just as easily in Europe. So I think I'll go, you know, go on a pilgrimage to Spain. Like, okay, Charlie, you know, that's great, you know. And here I am like, oh, I got to go do this. I got to get that. And after that, I got to do this. And, you know, he was just like, well, you know, I'm almost 70 years old. So I guess this is pretty good. You know, he had a totally different way of thinking about it. And he was much calmer about it. And he was much more accepting of it than I was at that point. There was an element of just being so frantic. And again, frantic is never going to help us out of any situation. Clarity is what helps us to make sound decisions. It helps us to be able to discern more clearly. And while that was in there, it was certainly in the mix. It was always happening. It was always like our computers running in the background for me, but it would get overshadowed most of the time by my fearful, suggestible, and then my whole story, this story that got built up that I'm sick, I'm always going to be sick, I'm always going to have to do these things, my life is over. At one point, I really thought my life was over. I was very suicidal, and I had, I had a plan. I was going to, run a pipe from my furnace into my bedroom, and I was going to take my 2 dogs with me because I knew that nobody would take care of them the way I did. And, I would lay in bed and just think about this plan all the time. And then I sought out a therapist to help me hold my suffering. And I had an insight. I was like, well, you're spending all this money, you're doing all this stuff to get better, but you're running this other track to kill yourself. So maybe if you like got those on the same path, you might have better results. That was a huge insight for me. And it really did start to turn things around. So these insights were always happening, always coming, always pointing me, always directing me. And, ultimately led me to the principles and led me to the solutions rather than, again, the frantic, grabbing at whatever came down the pike. Much of which now that I look at it with clarity was crazy. I mean, it was crazy. And I know lots of people who do lots of crazy things with this because they are so fearful. Our common sense goes out the window. And I would buy into things that now I look at, I think, just to give you an example, there's this guy online who tells everybody that they have to drink like 16 ounces of organic celery juice every day. Like everybody in the world needs to do this for their health. And I went out and bought organic celery, and I'm like, this stuff tastes terrible. I'm not drinking this stuff. Like, are you kidding me? And then one of my friends who did got really, really sick from it because, of course, you can't do anything in that kind of extremity and not have some impact from it. So again, the common sense to know, to be able to discern a theory from a fact, that's a big jump. But now I listen to some of this stuff that before I would have thought, yeah, I got to do that. I need that. Now I listen to it. I think, says who? Like, really? Really? Because I know, and I always knew, but again, it got sort of overshadowed by the fear. I always knew that there is no such thing as one size fits all medicine or one size fits all recovery, or one size fits all health. That what's good for one person may not be good for someone else. And in fact, may be really detrimental for someone else. So when, people would hold out that we need research and we need science and we need, cures and we need all these things, I think, well, first of all, who's going to do the research? Who's going to fund the research? Who's going to review the research? And then, my experience with research is they tell you, yep, we've researched it. It's now written in stone. And then 10 years later, it's different. So one of the greatest gifts, I think, that my psychological well-being brought me during that time was the recognition and acceptance of not knowing. Really embracing the fact that you don't know. Now, there were times when I would get really angry about that I would get really angry that the doctors weren't even trying to know about this and they weren't doing anything about it. And this was the greatest, the pandemic that ever was in the history of mankind. And I would be furious about that. And then I would settle down and I would think, these poor guys, think about what they're dealing with. They haven't got any of the tools they need to figure this stuff out. Nobody taught them this stuff in medical school. They're doing the best they can to manage their offices and keep up with billing and health insurance and, and these patients who come in with all these things they haven't got a clue. And my compassion would flare rather than my anger. Because one of the things that I did learn, which I think is a really important thing, is that our body of medical knowledge doubles every 5 years. That's a lot to keep up on. It's a lot to keep up on. So I would feel compassion, and then I would, try to find ways rather than, running down my battery with anger to, try to educate people. Try to educate doctors and to look for doctors. Clients would come to me because I am a clinical social worker, and this became sort of my area of expertise during those years. People would come to me and I would say, you really need to, they're like, I need a Lyme literate doctor who, psychiatrist. And I said, well, there aren't any, but here's what I can tell you. Find a doctor who can say to you, I don't know, but I'm willing to help you look. And that, when we can have that kind of clarity, that really embraces what is, which is, there aren't any doctors. And the doctors they had were all out of pocket and were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars per visit. And then they'd give you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of stuff to take. So, it was really a rich man's disease to treat.
Mm.
So my suffering really was coming from my thinking, the way that I thought about it. And when I would slip out of that way of thinking and slip into another way of thinking, and my mind settled down, and I would listen to my intuition, and I would listen to my own inner clarity and my own, and follow my curiosity without the urgency, ultimately that is what led me to health. But it could have been a lot shorter and a lot cheaper had I known this at the outset. So I just want to talk about one last thing before I finish, and then I'm happy to answer whatever questions people have or any comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. One of the big insights that ultimately led me to the principles, and it was a big one, was that one day I woke up, and I think this was about 6 years in. I woke up and I had an insight that Lyme disease was the first thing on my mind when I woke up in the morning, and it was the last thing on my mind when I went to sleep at night. And it was basically on my mind whenever my mind wasn't distracted by anything else, like vacation. Isn't that interesting? You can go on vacation, your symptoms go away.
Mm.
So I always thought that was pretty interesting. So I would do this, right? I would go I was thinking, well, this can't be helping me. I don't know why. It was just like, I don't think this is helping me, that this is the only thing that's on my mind. So then in my journey, I've found this thing called amygdala retraining, and I looked it up, and I, paid a lot of money for that. And the fascinating thing was, and again, this was pre-principles, but the fascinating thing, this guy had done this tremendous research basically on the fight or flight response and how our thinking, just like runs down our batteries, which of course just really is the opposite of what you need for your health. What you need for your health is to rest, body, mind, and spirit. But I was running down my batteries with just like constantly checking, am I okay? What's the symptom? What does it mean? Where does it go? What does the future hold? I mean, my big thing was, I'm going to end up in a wheelchair drooling, because my myelin sheath is going to melt down and I'm going to have MS. Or as one of my doctors told me, no, you're not going to go blind. You're just going to get Alzheimer's, So your mind is like going. But I realized, okay, this isn't good for me. So I buy this program. He did, and he does, I think, some excellent research on the fight or flight response and the way the amygdala and the brain work to run down the batteries. But his treatment was basically every cognitive technique that was ever designed by mankind in the field of psychology. It was like, for those of you who know the game Twister, it was like a twister board. You hung it on your wall and you did like this whole thing, like you do thought stopping, then you do positive thinking, then you do this, then you take deep breaths, then you do. I mean, it was literally like, I still have it. You do, really do. I'm not kidding, but every single cognitive technique that we ever came up with in the field of psychology, this was the treatment. And then you had to meditate. So you had to do this whole thing every time you had a thought about your illness, right? Then you had to meditate for 20 minutes, 3 times a day, 2 different types of meditation. Well, you can imagine how well that worked for me. I was like, no, I can't do this. I'm screwed. I'm going to have this for the rest of my life because I can't do this stuff. This is too hard for me. I can't focus. I have ADD. I have chronic Lyme disease in my brain, whatever my story was. But then that ultimately led me to the principles. And when I finally heard Annika Hurwitz, who was my first mentor, talk about
wisdom. About, Barbara? You've made a leap there. How did that come about?
Okay, well, that's good. So the leap is that I, at that point, was so burned out. I was so exhausted. I couldn't do my amygdala retraining. I couldn't keep up with, I was out of money. I was really at my wit's end. I didn't know where else to go. And I had taken on all these really sick clients in my practice and now I see again where I created my own burnout, because my approach with these guys is because the medical field didn't believe them. I believed them. I not only believed them, I believed that they were victims and that this was the most terrible thing that could ever happen to anybody. And my basic approach was, this sucks, and you poor thing. And so I just doled out sympathy. And sympathy runs dry. The well runs dry. And what I found was, with that approach of innocently making these people into chronic victims, they became very unwell. So they were more needy, more imbalanced, more unhappy, more psychologically unwell. And my batteries started to run down. And I remember people would come up to my office and just kind of dump all this stuff on me. And one day I thought, this isn't good for me. I don't think it's good for them, but it's definitely not good for me, and I don't think it's good for my health. And at this point, I'd spent a lot of money on my health. So I said, well, I don't think I can do this anymore. So I called everybody I knew and I said, don't send me any more Lyme patients. I can't, I'm done. I'm burned out. So I'm going to now write a book. I'll write a book. I'll go on the speaker circuit and write a book. So I pulled together a group of people who also had Lyme, also were psychologists, and we started a support group. And in that support group, one of my colleagues who started the Martha's Vineyard Lyme group said, I have someone who I talked to who changed my life, and I think we all need to talk to her. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. Really? Like, we have work to do. We got to find out about neurological Lyme disease so I can write this book. And I'm like, really? Oh, so, you know, we're on Zoom, so you can't really like roll your eyes, but she said she could feel it, you know. So I was very skeptical, and she had us talk to Annika. And Annika, you know, started talking about things like wisdom and common sense and intuition. And I thought, well, that's what I'm writing my book about. And that really piqued my interest. Like, I really don't want to write about neurological Lyme disease because I'm not a scientist and I really don't want to do everything that I need to do to write that book. But wow, that's sort of what I have written. The stuff that had gotten written was all about that, how intuition had guided me to know enough is enough, or to my clients, when I would lay out this smorgasbord of treatment, that they would be able to say, I'll have that, please. You know, like, what's that about? And so I didn't know what that was about, but I was intrigued by it. And so when Annika mentioned that, I signed on, and that has changed my life really dramatically, as I know all of us who have been touched by the principles have seen. So I hope that's a better segue, Christian.
That's great. Yeah. And so your introduction to the principles was through Annika, and you've described that changing your life. But how, you know, just to bring us up to date, how has that also, you know, how has that played out in terms of your physical health and or your
Well, yeah, thank you. That's a great question. My physical, I would say, pretty much returned to full wellness. As, by the way, have most of my friends who were very, very sick. Part of that is time. You know, this idea that we have instant health is not true, and especially when you're treating multiple organisms and multiple organs. But most of us have returned to really pretty good health when we were willing to make the kinds of lifestyle changes that were necessary. And when we got lucky, you know, there are a lot of people who don't get lucky and don't find their way to health, but we did. But my health really started to improve when my mind settled down. And I developed more and more clarity. I stopped taking most things. I stopped thinking of myself as fragile. I think that was the biggest thing. I stopped believing that I had something that was incurable and unmanageable, and I had to be on hyper alert to take care of it. Now, you know, now I'm much more relaxed about those things. You know, I know that if I eat a lot of gluten, my joints hurt, so I don't eat a lot of gluten. You know, it's pretty simple. But I would say that, you know, I still have symptoms. I still have some, not a lot. But when I have a symptom, I no longer write a story about what that means and where I'm going, you know, what's going to happen to me in the long run. And that in and of itself just calms things down. So you're not, again, setting off the whole anxiety path that, you know, that is not good for us. So as soon as that happened, really, I started to have much better health as my mind settled down. And then, you know, I would say one of the big things that I knew all along was that I was living in a very moldy house. It was an old summer house that was beautiful. I loved it. I loved it. It's, of course, where I used to get bitten by ticks all the time because it had a lot of gardens and a lot of deer and a lot, but it was moldy. And, people said, you're not going to get well living in a moldy house. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want to move. So it was my will over this house. And then finally, we had an opportunity to purchase a house in Europe, and we did. And when I moved out of that house, pretty much most of my symptoms went with it. So I knew that was it, because I would go on vacation, I wouldn't have the problem, and then I'd come back the minute I hit the door, I'd have the problem. So I knew, but I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want to do what I had to do, which was to sell a house in a place that I loved so dearly. So, but when I did, and when I was able to move out, then I noticed really most of my neurological symptoms went away. And again, sometimes I have them. Sometimes I get extremely tired. I think the vaccine or the booster shot really stirred things up again. It doesn't mean that we don't have things going on, but again, I don't panic about it. I can settle my mind down to say, okay, what do you think you need here? And that brings clarity, trial and error, and a real sense of peace about not knowing. I don't know all the answers, but I can listen. I'm much better at listening to my intuition, to an inner guide. And I think the more inner peace that I have, again, the more wellness I have just overall. And will it rear its ugly head again? I got bitten by another tick last night. Yeah, I guess it will, but I'll find my way. I guess I really now have more confidence in my ability to find my way and to accept what is. That, this is the nature of disease in the future. And, I don't think it has to ruin our lives. So does that help? Does that answer it for you?
Well, that's great. That's great. We do have a number of people on the call. I don't know if anybody wants to, I don't know if people have joined to ask any questions or share their experience. Are you up for that, Barbara?
Oh, please. I'd love that.
So if you have anything at all to ask, share, object to, please do just unmute yourself and come in. Knocked over in the rush.
Well, one of the things, if this will help, I'll just keep going. One of the things that I think now I really am most impacted by is something I heard during my journey, which is that nature doesn't make mistakes. That, part of the anger for people, or part of the upset, is, why do we have ticks? Why do we have ticks? Ticks are stupid. Hitler did these terrible things to ticks, and just this whole big story. And it's like, we have ticks. I don't know, why do we have poisonous snakes and tarantulas? I don't know, mosquitoes, malaria, I don't know. But nature doesn't make mistakes, and it also doesn't exist for our convenience. So when I have the mindset that that this is a great horror, that this is something that we need to fight, and there are always people who go from, in their victim mode, I think, who go to being Lyme warriors, And boy, talk about running down your battery. Like, what are you worrying about? I mean, I get, the medical community certainly does not get this, and it's awful. It truly is awful what is done to people in the name of, modern medicine, in a lot of areas. But, this idea that if I don't know what's wrong with you, then there's something wrong with your psychological well-being, makeup is 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 not good. But when you can see that with clarity, when you can see that that's all that's going on, is that they are doing the best they can at the level of consciousness that they have, that looks real to them. I remember spending a friend of mine, after I'd made my announcement that I wasn't doing any more Lyme work, a very dear friend of mine called me and said, please talk to this friend of mine. He's got, every Lyme condition under the sun. Please just talk to him. So I spent an hour. We were driving to Boston. I spent an hour on the phone with this guy. And he said, well, thank you very much. I'll talk to my doctor about that. And I thought, that's it. I'm done, because doctors don't know, but we think they know, and we want them to know. And we give them a lot of power when we believe that they know more than they know. But the truth is that our individual variability, our individual variability are like our fingerprints. There are an infinite number of individual variables with any health issue.
Yeah. Yeah. It strikes me, Barbara, that what you're describing is something I came across. My last job was rather different to what I do now, and I worked in the sort of medical legal field, and sometimes with people with chronic conditions of all sorts, and sometimes with profound disability, and but one thing I observed, there were I think there's an outcome that can occur for people, and I've experienced it myself, where you are having symptoms, possibly pain in the back and neck, and I'm not saying that this is Lyme disease. I'm talking more generally, tiredness, weariness, and all sorts of symptoms. And it's not that they're in your head in the sense of you can switch it off or get a better attitude or something, but they are being created from within. And I think that's and that can be overlaid on another condition, whether it's something congenital or something that's acquired or an infection, and we don't really have the language or the expertise to deal with that in a proper and sympathetic and effective way. But it seems to me that again, perhaps speaking for myself, because I was really burdened with all of those kinds of symptoms, and the pain was very real. I mean, it was excruciating pain that would wake me up at night and so on. But it was coming from what you were described as overload of my brain running down my battery. I'm sure of that now, and I didn't have the way into that. I didn't know that at the time. And I suspect that sometimes that's the frustration of it's not primarily a medical problem, perhaps, and that people they're experiencing symptoms of pain or discomfort or confusion or memory loss, etc. Just a million different symptoms, and they seem like medical issues, but that's not the source of. That's not where recovery and peace of mind is found, I suspect. And I suspect that what you're describing so eloquently is that the kind of awakening, the kind of realization of the inner resources that people have when they discover the principles is what leads to that more holistic cure, if cure is the right word, or healing maybe, or health.
Yeah. Health.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Again, I think when we chase the idea that health is one thing, you know, I would say that I have really quite good health. I have really, at almost 70 years old, better health than many of the people that I know. Um, and I still have something that goes on that flares regularly, that, you know, I have symptoms that, you know, many people would chase down, you know, go have all kinds of neurological testing and, you know, MRIs and CAT scans and, you know, run. And that's certainly what I did a lot of at the early part. But then I thought, why am I doing this? You know, that was again another insight, like, it is what it is. And the more I could just accept that, you know, and be with that, without all the fear and the impatience of making it be something other than what it was. And I used to spend, for 18 months, I would spend probably 14 to 16 hours a day laying in bed. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't really function. I would get up, I'd feed the dogs, I'd let them in and out. That was about it. Um, so, you know, my body's wisdom really was helping me to rest. And when you can rest without that, you know, running story running through your head, that's where you're scaring yourself to death about what it means, you know, again, your body has a much better chance of healing much faster.
Yeah. Or to put it the opposite way, if you're spending every waking hour running a script about how horrific your health is and how hopeless it is, and taking those thoughts very, very seriously indeed, you've got almost no chance of being healthy and content and peaceful in life.
It's true. And once we label something with a diagnosis, you know, there are a lot of people in the Lyme community who, you know, call themselves Lyme warriors or Lymies or whatever. They walk through life with this, you know, this identification. It's kind of like what we have done in the field of psychology with all these diagnoses. You know, you're labeling something that then becomes attached to you, like it is who you are. And you live your life through that lens, and make your decisions based on that. And again, it's not anything that's being run by wisdom. You know, it's really our will, our impatience, our frustration, our confusion, our anger, our whatever it is. And again, it's not a place where healing can most comfortably happen. You know, when you can just relax and just, you're along for the ride.
Yeah.
And now when I have weird symptoms, it's, I kind of find it funny. I mean, it, you know, it's kind of funny. It's like, oh, this is weird. It's like your body is possessed by demons. I mean, it's like, and it's kind of science fiction-esque, you know. And we did, some of us who became very close friends during our Lyme journey, you know, were able to laugh at times about how science fiction-esque it was. You know, you'd have these bizarre things happening to your body, and when you weren't in a place of terror, you could just be like, what the heck, you know. And you just had a lightness to spirit around it, without making yourself sicker with fear, and then again labeling with diagnoses that, you know, I've seen so many people over the years with chronic pain and other things, and this is some of the great work some of the other folks in Through Principles community are doing now, you know, looking really carefully at the mind-body experience. But you just really see how we innocently use our thinking to the detriment of our health, and then we believe that that's who and what we are, and it's a room with no escape.
Yeah.
And then it becomes more and more and more true to you, and the symptoms take on more and more of a life of their own. I remember I had a client who had terrible chronic Lyme and terrible pain. His spine was basically degenerated from who knows, whether it was Lyme or other things. But I remember he came up to my office one day, and after we'd been talking about the principles for a while, and he sort of stood up, which was unusual because he was really very having difficulty standing straight. He stood up and he went, "Oh, Barbara, I get it. The pain is really just a sensation in my body. The rest is all thought, you know?" And I was like, yeah. And for that whole session, he was able to sit up and he wasn't shifting every 3 minutes. Now, it came back because he had nerve on nerve. I mean, there was pain, but he wasn't exacerbating it. He wasn't, taking bellows to it and working himself up over it. And in that calmness, the pain just naturally, when you can relax, when you take a deep breath, you relax, the shot doesn't hurt as much when it's going in. I mean, there's all kinds of work that's been done on this.
Yeah.
But when you don't know that, and again, you have all this belief system around your illness and your disability or whatever it is, I think that the symptoms just magnify and grow like yeast. And then, you become permanently disabled, chronically ill, whatever it is. And that's, I guess, the thing that I used to proudly tell people I had chronic Lyme disease. And now when I go to the doctor, and of course it's in all my medical charts, and they say, "Oh, you have chronic Lyme," I say, "No, I don't really anymore." And they're like, "No, I'm fine," but they keep it in the chart anyway. And I never would have dreamed before the principles that I didn't have chronic Lyme disease. Like, that would never have occurred to me. I would have gone through the rest of my life believing that, and that I needed all of these things, that I had to take on vacation and that I had to take with me everywhere I went, and, to be okay. And now I have freedom from all of that. And I know if I get somewhere and I have a problem, I'll figure out what to do about it. I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm really at peace with whatever it is. And I don't know what it is anymore. And neither does anybody else. And I'm okay with that.
Well, that sounds like an ideal place to leave it. And we are also at the top of the hour. So thank you so much for all of that, Barbara. And
thank you.
Joined us, and the recording will be available probably tomorrow now.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Christian. I was ripe and ready for this conversation, so I'm glad that I got to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. And I'm just going to end the recording.